This is the PowerPoint for the last period in the APUS History Framework, Period 9. This is actually one of my favorite periods to teach, just because there's so much great stuff that's going on during this time period, and it's extremely complicated. In fact, I know a lot of people will disagree with the next statement that I'm going to make. Many people consider this type of history to not really be history at all because it's just too recent and we don't have enough interpretation or enough context to really teach this as history. In my personal opinion, I actually disagree with that. To me, history is about revision and new interpretations that are constantly coming. I will agree that we don't have enough context at this time period to have as good of an interpretation as we may have later on. But I think in many ways, the interpretations that we have are of their own relative quality, considering that we are still living within this time period, trying to understand why we have come to the place that we have. So I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview of Period 9 and what's going on in Period 9. And I'm sure many of my biases and interpretations are going to come out during this time. But I find it one of the most fun and exciting periods to teach to the students because it's so relevant to their lives. So Period 9 stretches from 1980 to the present. One of the big things I want to get across to the students right from the start is the rise of the New Right or the New Conservative movement. In the 1950s, a lot of social scientists believed that the New Right was basically just a passing movement and that it was basically a segregationist movement, a states' rights movement, a bigoted movement of the South, and that this was sort of the last gasp of conservatism and that liberalism had really taken over and it had become the predominant belief system both in the United States and in Northern Europe, and eventually it would spread out to the rest of the world. I think in many ways this was really a misinterpretation of what the New Right was really all about. The New Right gets started off with some huge authors, but probably the most important is Friedrich Hayek. Friedrich Hayek was an Austrian. He wrote the book called The Road to Serfdom. In this book, he criticized the rise of both Western-style socialism and the New Deal in America. He didn't see it necessarily as socialism itself, but rather he saw the New Deal as what he called creeping socialism, in which he believed that in order to solve problems, the government, the federal government in the United States, and centralized governments in Western Europe had to create bureaucracies in order to solve problems. And as they tried to solve these problems, the problems were just too complicated and would end up causing unintended consequences. So new bureaucracies would arise in order to solve those consequences. And before long, what would end up happening is that even with the best of intentions, liberal governments would eventually create a socialist government that gained more and more power over the common citizen. Economically, he also criticized government intervention into the economies, creating what he called virtual bubbles. The idea of a virtual bubble was that anytime there was a problem in the economy, the government would step in and seem to solve the problem. All it did, though, was to create economic growth that was just dependent upon that government intervention and eventually would collapse. And if it did, the next time around, it'd be far worse than the collapse that happened this time. Politically, he criticized government technocratic elites for trying to rationalize local differences, and this gets back to that bureaucratic problem and the problem of unintended consequences. Also, religious conservatives at this time period started to mix together with this new movement, in which they feared that liberal culture was starting to undermine traditional wisdom, faith, and traditional family values. And this goes back in many ways to the period of the 1920s with modernism versus traditionalism. One of the big promoters of these ideas was a man named William F. Buckley, and he created the National Review, which is still around today. The National Review became probably one of the most important new right conservative magazines that would gather together the major conservatives of the time and present their arguments to the public. And while in the 1950s it was a magazine really for a minority of society, it has grown and grown in prominence. It had a massive influence on people on the conservative side or the new right side for being able to present their particular viewpoint on different things that are going on with the federal government. Where this all came to a boil was in the 1964 election with Barry Goldwater. Senator Barry Goldwater argued that his position was a libertarian one, which stressed states' rights views over the federal government. He was oftentimes described as an extremist, especially when it came to foreign policy. He seemed to imply at one point that if necessary, we might be able to use nuclear bombs within the Vietnam War context. Eventually, Barry Goldwater was just seen as too extreme for his time period, and he lost the election to Lyndon Johnson by a landslide. Johnson was able to win 486 electoral votes. Goldwater only won 52 electoral college votes. Johnson saw this win as a mandate to start to pursue civil rights and anti-poverty legislation, especially the most important being his Great Society programs. During this time period, there was also an economic revolution that took place. Up until now, the predominant economic model was what was called the Keynesian economic model coming out of the Great Depression, and most economists at the time saw this as the primary way of how to look at economics. However, there was a man in the 1950s who challenged this, and his name was Milton Friedman. The story about Milton Friedman, he taught at the Chicago School of Economics, the story about him was that he really wasn't much of a guy to look at. He was sort of this short guy who didn't come across physically as being somebody who would be able to just dominate over a screen or a stage. But his students always described him as someone they absolutely loved. When they came into his classroom, he knew how to tell stories and how to explain economics in a way that just made sense to them. And he had this charisma and passion. In fact, the way to describe Milton Friedman was that he was a guru when it came to economics. He argued for something called monetarism, which he argued that the primary problem as to why we had the Great Depression and why we continue to have recessions had much more to do with the Federal Reserve, and that the Federal Reserve had created what he called growth or velocity of currency in the economy that tended to be detrimental for the economic boom and bust cycles. Along with this, in the Chicago School of Economics, a new form of economics arose called supply-side economics, which in some ways really was not all that new. It goes back to the period before the Great Depression with what was known in that time period as laissez-faire economics. Supply-side economics just argued that basically when we increase costs on business due to increased taxes and regulations, there's less of a likelihood that businesses are going to hire people or increase wages. Then what really caused these new ideas that tended to be at the fringe of economics to come to the center of economics was what happened in the 1970s. In the 1970s, the economy faced something that no economist had predicted before, and that was stagflation. Typically, in the economy, you have one of two problems: inflation or unemployment. As currency inflates and as prices inflate, less and less people get jobs, and so because of that, there's less and less spending power, and inflation will come down. On the opposite side, as more and more people get hired, that causes more consumer spending and eventually will cause more inflation, so then less people will be hired. Basically, you fluctuate back and forth between inflation and unemployment. What nobody knew was going to happen was that both problems would happen at the exact same time. And that led up to the Reagan Revolution. In 1980, Ronald Reagan promised to increase American leadership in the world in foreign policy, as well as to decrease costs on businesses. The way he did this was, when he came into office, he lowered the tax rate for the top marginal tax rates. They went from 90% down to 55%, and then eventually down to 28% by the end of the 1980s. The Federal Reserve chairman at the time, who actually was nominated and put into power by President Jimmy Carter and then continued under Reagan's time period, was Paul Volcker. Volcker raised interest rates. In fact, at one point, the interest rates went all the way up to about 21%. And the idea was to shake out inflation from the economy. How would that work? By raising interest rates so high, fewer and fewer people would be willing to take out loans, and that would basically cause a recession to take place in the economy, which is exactly what happened. From about late 1979 up until late 1982, there was a double-dip recession that took place in the economy. And during that time period, people from around the globe, as well as within the United States, worried that Paul Volcker had gone too far. But by the time we got out to early 1983, the inflationary rate had been shaken out of the economy, and the economy began to boom. In 1983, the economy took off, bouncing back from stagflation, and it gave the impression to people that the Reagan Revolution had worked. By reducing costs on businesses and by shaking inflation out of the economy started to roar. This seemed to mark the end of the Keynesian time period. Keynes had seemed to work from about 1945 up until somewhere in the 1970s, probably dated to about 1979, but it seemed that after this time period, the Reagan Revolution and a return to supply-side economics or laissez-faire economics was necessary in order to reduce costs on businesses. Reagan and foreign policy. So when Reagan entered into office, the Soviet Union had invaded into Afghanistan. Reagan's diplomacy was to bankrupt the Soviet Union, both by keeping them bogged down in Afghanistan as well as increasing the arms race. However, something strange had happened within the Soviet Union Most people in the United States had no idea what was going on. And that was a new president came into power who was young by the standards of the people who lived in the Soviet Union at the time period, as far as presidents go, Mikhail Gorbachev, who had supposedly at one point had gone to Canada. When he was in Canada, he saw how socialism worked there and decided that he wanted to reform the Soviet Union to move more in the direction of a Western European or Canadian socialism. So he came back to the Soviet Union and started to institute reforms. During his second term, Reagan saw this happening and made a dramatic shift. During his first term, Reagan really believed that he could bankrupt the Soviet Union through programs like the Star Wars or Strategic Defense Initiative program. But during his second term, Reagan realized that actually Gorbachev was trying to transition the USSR government away from communism. And so Reagan began doing diplomacy with Mikhail Gorbachev to lower tensions, especially when it came to nuclear arms, so that Gorbachev could continue these reforms. Clinton's third way. When Bill Clinton came into office in 1992, he argued that the Reagan Revolution had had a serious drawback, and that was the growth of a massive debt in the federal government. When Reagan came into office, the debt was about $900 billion, and being at that rate, most people at that time period were claiming that we were starting to get out of control and we really needed to lower it. In fact, Reagan, that was one of Reagan's promises, was that we would collect enough taxes during the 1980s in order to pay down that debt. By the time he left, the debt was about $3 trillion. So Bill Clinton claimed that while there may have been economic growth during the 1980s, we had suffered because of the low tax rate, and now we were in a massive debt. So Clinton called for a rise in taxes, and he was able to get that right after the recession that took place from about 1990 up to 1992. He was able to get a rise in taxes back up to 39%. This is far away from what had happened at the beginning of the Reagan time period, but it did go up from the 28% up to a 39% rate. He also wanted to pursue regional trade agreements like NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, which was meant to deregulate trade and increase economic growth. Clinton also supported the WTO, or World Trade Organization, International Court, which demanded that its members lower tariffs. So what exactly was Clinton attempting to do here? Well, it's interesting, and what I always explain to my students is that when Bill Clinton came into office, the predominant consensus in the country was a conservative mindset, and Clinton knew he could not win an election if he was going to run on an old-style liberalism that was sort of like the ones of the 1960s. So he pursued what he called a third-way politics. On the one hand, he pursued deregulation of trade and deregulation overall on business. That appealed to the sort of Reagan conservatism of the 1980s. But he also called for a raising of taxes. But the raising of taxes was to pay down the debt. Again, pursuing a sort of bringing in conservative values. The idea that Clinton was doing was redefining liberalism in order to have an interventionist government, but an interventionist government that could be done within the framework of a Reagan Revolution. Clinton was doing something called triangulating the Republican policies. This was the idea of the 1990s. And here was the notion. In 1992, Clinton was elected. There was a lot of enthusiasm for Clinton, but then the Congress, which had been Democratic for over 40 years, turned Republican in the next election in 1994. When Clinton ran in 1996, he realized if he wanted to keep office, he would have to sound somewhat Republican while pursuing a new redefinition of liberalism. So that's what he did. He triangulated Republican policies and built a new liberalism that was based upon government supports while trying to make business interests more satisfied. President Bush, 9/11. So on September 11, 2001, Al-Qaeda attacked the Twin Towers, and when it did so, it led to the President George Bush doctrine. So what was this doctrine? Bush argued for something called preempting terrorist attacks. In other words, what he said was that we cannot wait for terrorism to attack us in order for us to defend ourselves. Rather, we needed to get on them first. In order to do that, we were not just going to attack terrorists, but we would attack any countries that supported terrorism. The two major wars that he started in order to do this were Afghanistan and Iraq. In Afghanistan, he claimed that the Taliban had been hiding al-Qaeda, and therefore they had to be defeated. Then he turned and claimed that Iraq was building weapons of mass destruction, and if for whatever reason those WMDs should land up in al-Qaeda's hands, devastating consequences could occur. So the United States went in, and the overall prediction was that Iraq had been so defeated back in 1991 during the Persian Gulf War, they would not be able to last more than 6 months. Well, they didn't last for more than 3 weeks, which created a massive amount of excitement that very possibly the U.S. military could be used in order to redefine the Middle East. But just the opposite ended up happening. From 2003 until 2005, a sectarian civil war erupted in Iraq, leading to an eventual disillusionment in America for the possibility of U.S. nation-state building. And then, in 2008, the economic nation-state market collapsed, as well as the global marketplace came very close to collapsing. Back in 2001, Alan Greenspan, the head of the Federal Reserve, had lowered interest rates. He did that because of the recession that was taking place after the dot-com bubble. He saw that there just wasn't enough production going on in order to get the economy going again. He decided to lower interest rates. The problem with lowering interest rates, good side of lowering interest rates, is that you can have more borrowing that takes place, and therefore you would have more expansion of industry, more buying of things like homes and cars, etc. The downside of lowering interest rates is that people who invest aren't getting much money on their investments, so they have to look elsewhere to see where they can best get their money for investments. The best place at the time period was in the real estate market. The way that it worked was through a merging of three different markets, the real estate, banking, and insurance markets. This is very complicated and very difficult for the students to understand, but this was what was called the derivatives market. In the derivatives market, a bank would go out and they would sell a mortgage to someone. And for a long time, they were selling mortgages to people who could afford it, but eventually they sold what were called subprime mortgages, in which the market of people who could afford these mortgages kind of dried up. So they started selling these mortgages to people who really couldn't afford it. Now, the hope was that as home values go up, eventually these families are in a home, they could just use the money that they have out of that home in order to pay back their loans. If they couldn't, if for whatever reason they lost their job or they just weren't being responsible or they just didn't have enough money to pay it back, not a big deal. The bank would just take over the home and they would go ahead and sell it. What the banks then did with these mortgages is that they sold these mortgages out to the stock market. And in the stock market, they were all bundled up together and put into a group of different mortgages that people then went and invested in. Now, what if you lost out on this investment? Well, there was one more part of this merger, and that was insurance markets. Insurance groups, like for example AIG, began selling insurance to people that if they should lose money on any of these investments, they would be insured on their losses. The bet that everybody was making was that home values would continue to go up. And so even if you lose out on some purchases or you lose out on some insurance, you're still going to make far more money in the long term. But then in 2008, the derivatives markets collapsed. And it appears that the reason why was that there were so many subprime mortgages that were being sold to people that when one family after the next had to walk away from their houses, house values did not continue to go up. In fact, quite the opposite. If you start dumping products on the market at a massive rate, values will go down. As values went down on houses, banks were losing money. As banks lost money, the stock market lost money, and now these massive insurance companies could not keep up with the amount of loss that was taking place. This almost caused a global depression. In fact, just to give you a sense about how close we came to a global depression, Ben Bernanke, who was at the time period the head of the Treasury, as well as other major leaders of the government, called together all of the major U.S. Congress people into a meeting on a Thursday evening. And on that evening, they were told at the table that if the Congress did not act by the next Monday, that there would be a global depression that would be far worse than the depression of the 1930s. Eventually, this led to the U.S. government intervening in what is known as the TARP program, or the Temporary Assistance Relief Program, in which the U.S. government inserted massive amounts of money, hundreds of billions of dollars by the time it was done, over $1 trillion, into different banks in order to get the banks lending to one another again. And in the midst of both the Iraq problems as well as the global economic problems, a new president came aboard, which was Barack Obama. In 2008, Barack Obama came into power, promising a new role for government intervention in the economy. Obama had initiated, right after this, a $1.5 trillion stimulus plan into the economy. And he began calling for the Affordable Care Act, which would create state market exchanges where the government would subsidize the poor in order to buy healthcare insurance and provide regulations to make sure that there was a minimal level of healthcare insurance. In reaction to this, conservatives reacted with a new movement called the Tea Party movement, which challenged this increased role of the federal government. On the opposite side, the Obama foreign policy wanted to make sure that we got out of Iraq and then wind down the Afghanistan war. Now, here's what's interesting about this. And in fact, there was a recent article published in The Atlantic in which they interviewed Obama about this. For a long time, Obama has not been extremely clear on exactly what the Obama doctrine is. With President Bush, he was very clear that it was about preemptive wars. With Obama, it almost appears like he's been reacting to each situation that's been happening on a case-by-case basis. But that's not exactly the way Obama explained it. It appears that President Obama has had an overall foreign policy. What his foreign policy has been is to pivot to East Asia to open up new markets. So he definitely sees terrorism and terrorism in the Middle East as a problem, but it appears that he believes that the problems within the Middle East are far better contained and far better to be seen in a context that they can be contained, and that our bigger challenge really is to open up markets with East Asia in order to both limit Chinese power within Southeast Asia and to create more trade markets that will eventually lower the ability for terrorists and other organizations to have power in the world. At the time, in Iraq, after we had left, the Iraqi Prime Minister, Nouri al-Maliki, promoted his group, the Shiites, into power and began killing Sunnis. This eventually led to a collapse in Iraq. At the same time, the Syrian civil war began to arise. One of the groups that went out to the Syrian civil war in order to try to gain leverage was the group ISIS, the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. They used this crisis that was taking place in Syria in order to grow their own power. And eventually what they wanted to do under their leader, Baghdadi, was to create a caliphate that would stretch from Syria all the way out to Iraq. So, what are the takeaways that we can use with the students as we go through this last unit? One thing is to talk about how the Keynesian period ended in 1980 with the rise of a new conservative coalition which challenged government effectiveness. This included everybody from Milton Friedman and the Hayek group to religious conservatives to just general business conservatives. The Cold War ended, but gave rise to a new transnational economic and terror-related issues. But here's the interesting thing that happens. In 2008, when the derivatives market collapsed, Barack Obama came into office and appears to have given rise to a new resurgence of Keynesian government intervention. And so in many ways, we're right back to the beginning of this period, if not to the beginning of this class. Which way works better? Hamilton versus Jefferson, Hamilton being strong federal government, Jefferson strong states government. Hayek versus Keynesian economics, Hayek being minimal government, Keynesian being government intervention. We're still back at these patterns trying to figure out which way really works best in the US economy and for the globe. And today what we're seeing is conservative groups trying to maintain a more libertarian definition of government, while liberal groups are trying to maintain a more interventionist definition of government.